James Foster was an ordinary man in every sense of the word. In his small town, he was known not for any grandiose accomplishments, but for his genuine kindness, his dedication to his work, and his unwavering loyalty to those around him. He was a teacher at the local high school, a man who spent his days guiding teenagers through history lessons and his evenings volunteering at the community center. James wasn't the type to seek the spotlight. He was happy to live a quiet life, contributing to his community in small, meaningful ways. Everyone in town knew him, and he knew nearly everyone else, often greeting them with a nod and a wave as he passed by. But this ordinary life was about to take a turn, one that would thrust James into an unexpected whirlwind of events, changing him and the town forever. It was a crisp autumn morning when James woke up, ready for what he assumed would be a typical day. He planned to stop by the local cafe for coffee, as he did every morning, before heading to the school for his first class. The cafe was always a comforting start to his day, where he'd often chat with old friends and catch up on town gossip. The streets were bustling in their usual way, a steady hum of life in this close-knit community. As he entered the cafe, the familiar sound of laughter and chatter greeted him, along with the warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee. James ordered his usual, settled into his favorite corner seat, and prepared to relax before the busy day ahead. He noticed a few of his former students at the next table, waving to him and sharing a smile. Life here was predictable, and James liked it that way. But just as he took his first sip, the atmosphere changed. A loud voice erupted from the opposite end of the cafe. A man yelling angrily, words slurring slightly, his face red with frustration. The man was in a heated argument with another customer, his anger spilling over as people began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. James glanced over, his instincts as a teacher kicking in, always looking to de-escalate tense situations. He quietly observed for a moment, hoping the situation would resolve itself. But the argument only grew louder. The man became increasingly aggressive, and others in the cafe started whispering, eyes darting toward the door, hoping someone would step in. Without a second thought, James rose from his seat and approached the two men. He calmly asked them to lower their voices, gently placing a hand on the shoulder of the angry man in an attempt to ease the tension. His voice was steady and soothing, the same voice he used when handling restless students in the classroom. For a moment, it seemed to work. The man took a step back, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he seemed to register James's presence. But just as quickly as the tension had eased, it returned. The man interpreted James's intervention as a personal affront, his face contorting in anger as he accused James of trying to embarrass him. His voice grew louder, his gestures more animated. James tried to explain, but the man wasn't listening, his rage only intensifying. Suddenly, the cafe door swung open, and in walked a police officer, drawn by the commotion. The officer, a young man named Blake, was new to the town and unfamiliar with its residents. He saw the situation at a glance, James standing close to an agitated man, and made a snap judgment. Before James could say anything, Officer Blake approached him, his posture rigid, his expression stern. "Sir, I need you to step outside," Officer Blake said firmly, his hand resting on his belt in a way that made it clear he wasn't asking. James was taken aback. He started to explain, gesturing toward the man who had been causing the commotion, but Officer Blake cut him off. "Outside. Now." The patrons in the cafe looked on, their eyes wide with confusion and disbelief. Some of them began to speak up, trying to tell the officer who James was, that he was the last person who would be involved in any kind of altercation. But Blake wasn't listening. He was here to take control, and in his mind, James was part of the problem. With a mixture of frustration and resignation, James allowed himself to be led outside. The street was unusually quiet as Blake directed him to stand by the patrol car, his voice clipped and authoritative. James glanced around, seeing familiar faces in nearby shop windows and passersby who had stopped to watch. It was surreal. He, a well-known and respected teacher, was standing on the sidewalk under the watchful eye of a police officer, as if he were a common criminal. Then, without warning, Officer Blake began questioning him in a way that was more accusatory than curious. "What were you doing in there? Why were you involved in the argument?" The questions were fast and loaded, implying guilt rather than seeking the truth. James felt a pang of indignation rising within him, but he kept his tone respectful, explaining that he had simply tried to calm the situation. Blake, however, wasn't convinced. He seemed determined to fit James into the role of an aggressor, ignoring the protests from the onlookers who had stepped outside to try and clear up the misunderstanding. But Blake didn't relent. As more people gathered, he decided to detain James right then and there, turning him around and cuffing his hands behind his back. The crowd gasped, and someone shouted, "That's James Foster. You can't do that." Yet Blake was resolute, following protocol, as if James were a threat. As the cold metal cuffs closed around his wrists, James felt a sinking realization that this was no ordinary misunderstanding. This was a moment that could change his life in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The drive to the station was quiet, the only sounds being the occasional crackle of the police radio and James' own heavy breathing. He was in shock, his mind racing with disbelief and a creeping sense of anger. At the station, he was processed like any other suspect, photographed and fingerprinted, all while his mind raced with questions. How had things escalated so quickly? How had a simple attempt to help ended in handcuffs? And more troublingly, why hadn't Officer Blake listened to the townspeople who had vouched for him? Word of James's arrest spread through the town almost immediately. By the time he was released that evening, the entire community was abuzz, a mixture of outrage and confusion coloring every conversation. Friends, students, parents, and neighbors were stunned. Many of them couldn't believe what had happened to James, the kind-hearted teacher who had always been a pillar of the community. People gathered in small groups on street corners, outside stores, and in living rooms, discussing the incident and wondering what it meant for their town. Was this an isolated event, or did it reveal deeper issues? For James, walking out of the station felt like emerging from a bad dream, but the reality of the situation was painfully clear. He knew that things would never quite be the same. The shock of the day's events had shaken him deeply, leaving him with questions not just about the police, but about his place in a community that he had always considered a second family. James could still feel the cold metal of the handcuffs long after he had returned home. The shock of the day's events replayed in his mind like an unending loop. It was surreal to think that just hours ago, he'd been sitting peacefully in the cafe, sipping his morning coffee, and now he was an unwilling symbol of something far greater than he could yet comprehend. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of alienation from the very town he had devoted his life to. The reality of what had happened, the misunderstanding, the aggression, the humiliation of being cuffed and driven to the station, left a bitter taste he couldn't wash away. That evening, James paced around his small living room, his thoughts a jumbled mix of frustration, confusion, and hurt. The people in his life, those who knew him well, had always seen him as steady, level-headed, someone who worked tirelessly to help others. He was no stranger to de-escalating conflicts. He'd spent years breaking up teenage disputes and calming down frazzled parents, always striving to find peace and understanding. He thought back to his mother's words from years ago. "Be the calm in the storm, James. That's how you bring light into the world." But for the first time, he felt an anger he couldn't reconcile with those values. Why had the officers singled him out so quickly? Why had his voice, and the voices of his friends and neighbors, gone unheard? The phone calls began pouring in soon after he got home. Friends, family, colleagues, all shocked, all wanting to understand what had happened. The most unsettling part was that even as he explained, he couldn't make sense of it himself. Each retelling of the story felt like it had happened to someone else. He sensed the disbelief in their voices, the way some of them struggled to grasp how a man like him, mild, well-known, and utterly harmless, could be mistaken for a threat. More than one friend expressed outrage, urging James to pursue some kind of action. They didn't want him to just let it go. They wanted answers. James felt torn, caught between a desire to move past the ordeal and a newfound determination to stand up for himself. But his instincts told him this was no small matter. This was a wound, and it was starting to fester within the heart of the community. The next day, James tried to go about his routine, hoping a sense of normalcy would steady him. But he soon realized that things had shifted. At the grocery store, a few townspeople approached him, offering words of support and disbelief. The story had taken on a life of its own, rippling through the community in ways James hadn't anticipated. His arrest was all anyone could talk about. The cafe incident was now a focal point of tension, and the town seemed divided. Some people were sympathetic, horrified by the treatment he had received. Others, however, seemed hesitant, their support tinged with wariness, as if wondering if there was more to the story. James saw it in their eyes, a glimmer of doubt, a silent question hanging in the air. To his dismay, James also began hearing whispers that were far from supportive. Some people suggested that he must have done something to provoke the officer, speculating wildly about what could have caused the altercation. He overheard a snippet of conversation at the post office. Two people shaking their heads and muttering that perhaps he'd been out of line with the officer. It stung, the betrayal of people who knew him, or at least should have known him better than that. His mind returned to Officer Blake. The stern, unyielding face, the way his voice had overridden every protest in the cafe. James couldn't help but wonder, had Blake been looking for a confrontation, or had he simply made a hasty judgment? James decided he couldn't let it rest. The lack of answers, the mounting tension, the way his once familiar town now felt strange and foreign. It all pointed to something that had to be confronted. That evening, he called the mayor, a woman he'd known for years, and who, he hoped, would understand his position. She agreed to meet with him, and they arranged to sit down the following day. By then, James knew he needed more than just her sympathetic ear. He needed to know that someone in authority was willing to look at the broader picture. The meeting with the mayor was both encouraging and deeply troubling. While she expressed genuine regret for what had happened and promised to review the circumstances surrounding his arrest, she also spoke of the complexity of the situation. She mentioned that Officer Blake had been newly assigned to the town after a long career in law enforcement in a neighboring city. Apparently, he had come with a strong reputation, but also a history of handling situations assertively, a phrase James knew was a polite way of hinting at complaints and conflicts. His transfer to their small town had been intended as a fresh start, an attempt to let him prove himself in a quieter setting. But his hardline approach was proving to be a poor fit, and James was not the first to feel its sting. As they spoke, James began to sense a pattern emerging, a subtle but dangerous shift in the town's balance. The atmosphere was tense, brittle, and though the mayor was careful with her words, James detected a hint of resignation in her tone, as though she was grappling with forces beyond her control. "People are unsettled," she told him, her voice soft but firm, "and they're starting to take sides." She urged James to consider carefully before he made any public statements, cautioning that the community was more polarized than it had been in years. There were growing divisions between those who felt the need for stricter law enforcement and those who were outraged by the overreach that James had experienced. His story, she warned, could be a spark in a town already filled with dry kindling. Walking out of the mayor's office, James felt the weight of responsibility settle on him. He hadn't asked for any of this, but now his decision on how to proceed would impact more than just himself. It would resonate throughout the entire town. He knew he had a choice to make. He could stay quiet, fade back into his routine, and allow the incident to be buried with time. Or he could stand up and demand accountability, not only for himself, but for the community that was now watching him closely, many of them silently hoping he would speak out. He thought of the students he taught, the example he wanted to set for them. This wasn't just about personal justice anymore. It was about fairness, dignity, and the integrity of the place he called home. But as James wrestled with his decision, he discovered he wasn't alone. The whispers around town had reached more than just his friends and colleagues. Other residents began stepping forward, sharing their own stories of tense encounters with the new officer. An elderly couple approached him one morning outside his home, speaking softly as they recounted how Officer Blake had questioned them aggressively just a few days earlier. Another man, a store owner, mentioned how he had been given an unexpected ticket after a minor misunderstanding over a parking spot. These were quiet, law-abiding people who had never had trouble before, and now they, too, felt the strain of an authority figure who seemed to rule with a heavy hand. James realized that his experience wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger pattern. The town was beginning to change, slipping from the open, trusting place it had always been into something harsher, something divided. People were wary now, cautious of who might be listening, careful of their every move. And in that realization, James found his resolve. He would not stay silent. This wasn't just his fight. It was a stand for everyone who had been affected, for the community he loved and wanted to protect. Over the next few days, James began organizing a town hall meeting, hoping to create a space where people could voice their concerns openly without fear. He invited the mayor, members of the city council, and even reached out to Officer Blake, hoping he would come and listen to the people he was supposed to protect and serve. As the day approached, James felt a strange mix of dread and determination. He was not an activist, not a leader by nature, but he had been placed in a position where he had no other choice. The town was watching, waiting, and James was ready to speak, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been touched by the invisible shift that had started with one small incident in a cafe. He knew the meeting could go either way. It could be a healing moment, or it could deepen the divisions that had already begun to fester. But he also knew this was a turning point, and he was willing to do whatever it took to bring his town back from the edge. As the night of the town hall drew near, people gathered around James with a new energy. Old friends, strangers, even students and parents. Each one had a story, a memory, a vision for the community they wanted to rebuild. James listened to them all, absorbing their fears and hopes, their desire for change. The momentum was growing, and so was James's sense of purpose. For the first time since the incident, he felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that perhaps, just perhaps, something good could come from this. The night of the town hall arrived, casting an electric tension over the small community center. Word of James's story and his arrest had spread beyond the town limits, drawing people from neighboring areas who had heard about the town's struggles. The parking lot was full, with people arriving on foot, streaming in through the doors, filling every seat and lining the walls. The atmosphere was charged, with conversations buzzing at every corner, murmurs of anger, confusion, and anticipation blending into a hum that seemed to shake the very air. James felt the weight of every eye on him as he stood at the front of the room, a makeshift podium set up for speakers. The mayor sat to his left, her face tense and drawn. Members of the town council were there too, each one looking uneasy, as though they sensed they were about to face something much larger than they had anticipated. And standing toward the back, with his arms folded tightly across his chest, was Officer Blake. James hadn't been sure he would come, but there he was, eyes fixed on James with an unreadable expression. For a moment, James felt a flicker of doubt. Who was he to lead this conversation, to stand here as a representative of this community's frustrations? But then he looked out over the room, at the faces of people he had known for years, students, neighbors, friends, and felt a renewed sense of determination. He had been thrown into this role, but he would not let them down. James began by recounting his experience, his voice steady but firm. He described the events at the cafe, the confusion, and the shock of being arrested in front of people he knew. all because of a misunderstanding. He didn't embellish or exaggerate. He wanted to be fair and truthful. He could see the impact his words were having, watching as heads nodded and murmurs rippled through the room. He sensed that his story, as personal as it was resonating on a deeper level, touching on unspoken fears and concerns that had been simmering beneath the surface. And then, as he finished speaking, he opened the floor to others, inviting anyone who wished to share their own experiences. The room fell silent, and for a moment, no one moved. Then an elderly woman named Mrs. Hart, a lifelong resident and retired schoolteacher, stood up. She was small and frail, her hands trembling as she gripped the back of a chair for support. In a voice barely above a whisper, she recounted a recent encounter she had with Officer Blake. She had been driving home from the grocery store when she was pulled over for a minor traffic violation. The officer, she explained, had been unnecessarily harsh, speaking to her in a tone that left her feeling humiliated and frightened. "I've lived here all my life," she said, her voice breaking. "I never thought I'd feel afraid in my own town." Her words sent a ripple through the crowd, stirring emotions that had been held in check. Another person stood up, then another, each sharing their own stories, each one building upon the last. A young father described how he'd been pulled over while driving his children home, questioned in a way that left his kids shaken and in tears. A business owner recounted an encounter where Officer Blake had inspected his property after hours, without notice or explanation, making him feel as though he were a suspect rather than a respected member of the community. Story after story filled the room, some with details that seemed mundane in isolation, but together painted a picture of fear and mistrust. James felt his own anger mounting as he listened, his frustration mirrored on the faces around him. He could see the mayor shifting uncomfortably, glancing nervously at Officer Blake, who stood rigid, a barely perceptible flush creeping up his neck. Blake's eyes were fixed on the floor now, his jaw clenched as the stories continued to pour out. There was no room for him to speak, no room for his perspective. The townspeople had held these feelings for too long, and tonight they were reclaiming their voices. Finally, when it seemed that everyone who wished to speak had done so, the mayor cleared her throat and addressed the room. She expressed sympathy and acknowledged the concerns, promising to review the police department's policies and to ensure accountability. Her words were careful, diplomatic, designed to calm the crowd. But James could sense that the crowd was not placated. They didn't want polite reassurances. They wanted real answers, real change. They wanted an acknowledgement that what they were experiencing was wrong. Then, unexpectedly, Officer Blake stepped forward. The room fell silent, the tension almost palpable as he faced the crowd. He hesitated, glancing around at the sea of faces, and for the first time, he looked less like an officer of the law and more like a man who was uncertain, even vulnerable. I can see that I've made mistakes," he began, his voice tight. "I didn't grow up here. I don't know this town the way you all do. I was trained to take a firm stance, to be vigilant, to make quick decisions, but it seems that I may have been too quick, too harsh." The crowd watched him, some skeptical, others cautiously hopeful. James felt a strange mixture of emotions as he listened to Blake's admission. On one hand, he respected the man's willingness to stand up and admit his mistakes, but on the other, he felt the weight of the harm that had already been done. It wasn't enough to simply acknowledge the problem. Something needed to change. And as Blake's words hung in the air, James realized that this was his moment to push for exactly that. "Officer Blake," James said, stepping forward, his voice firm but not unkind. "We appreciate that you're here and willing to listen. But acknowledgement isn't enough. We need commitment. We need a promise that things will be different, that our concerns will be taken seriously." He looked around the room, seeing nods of agreement. "This isn't just about you and me. This is about restoring the trust that has been broken. Are you willing to work with us to rebuild that?" Blake hesitated, his gaze shifting to the mayor, then back to James. He seemed to wrestle with himself, the weight of the room pressing down on him. Finally, he nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do what it takes. I can't undo what's already happened, but I want to make things right." The words were hesitant, but there was a sincerity in them that the crowd recognized. People began to murmur, their anger softening slightly, a small but significant step toward healing. The meeting continued late into the night, with residents, town officials, and law enforcement discussing ways to improve communication and transparency. Suggestions were made for regular community police forums, conflict resolution training, and mentorship programs to help newcomers like Blake understand the town's unique culture and values. People left feeling a sense of relief, as though a dark cloud had begun to lift. It wasn't a complete solution, but it was a beginning. Over the following weeks, James threw himself into the work of mending the fractured trust within his community. He organized small group discussions, met with town leaders, and helped draft proposals for changes in the police department. To his surprise, Officer Blake reached out, expressing a desire to work alongside him, to listen and learn. Together, they began building a bridge between the police and the community, a fragile but hopeful effort that slowly began to take root. It was far from easy. James faced criticism, not just from those who felt he was too forgiving of Blake, but from people who doubted whether true change was possible. Yet he kept going, driven by a vision of a town where people felt safe, where their voices mattered, where mistakes could lead to growth rather than resentment. Gradually, people began to feel the difference. The community became more engaged, more aware, and in time, more unified. Months later, as James walked down the familiar streets of his town, he noticed subtle but profound changes. People greeted one another with a warmth that had been missing in those tense days after his arrest. The fear and distrust had not vanished completely, but there was a newfound resilience, a shared commitment to supporting each other. Even Officer Blake had become a more approachable figure, often seen chatting with locals, taking the time to get to know the people he served. The town had been tested, and though it had come close to fracturing, it had ultimately come together, stronger and more united than before. And as for James, he had transformed in ways he hadn't anticipated. He was no longer just a teacher, a quiet presence on the sidelines. He had become an advocate, a leader, someone willing to stand up and challenge the status quo when it mattered most. The experience had changed him, giving him a deeper understanding of justice, resilience, and community. Looking out at the town he loved, he felt a deep sense of pride, knowing that together they had faced a storm and emerged into a new, brighter chapter. As the weeks turned into months, the effects of James's efforts rippled through the town, creating subtle but transformative changes. The town hall meeting had been a pivotal moment, but the real work had just begun. James was no stranger to hard work, but this was unlike anything he'd ever taken on. His days were filled with community meetings, organizing workshops, and meeting with local officials to ensure that the promises made during that fateful evening didn't slip through the cracks. Every step he took was a reminder of how close his community had come to losing its identity, and he was determined to help it find a path forward. The first major challenge came when the town council debated the implementation of new community-oriented policing policies. Some council members were hesitant, wary of change and concerned about costs. They argued that the town had limited resources and that reallocating funds toward community programs might weaken the town's ability to handle real threats. James was frustrated by this mindset, but he understood their hesitation. It was a fear-based reaction, a defensive stance that he was all too familiar with, having seen it in Officer Blake and many others. James knew that if he wanted real change, he couldn't simply force these ideas through. He had to bring people along with him, one conversation at a time. To build trust, James began holding small, informal gatherings at the community center, inviting residents and officials alike to come and discuss their fears, concerns, and hopes for the town's future. He wanted to give everyone a voice, knowing that only by listening could he truly understand the root of their resistance. People spoke candidly, sharing stories about times they had felt unsafe, about their fears of crime, and about the need for protection. But they also shared a deep desire for fairness, dignity, and understanding, things that they felt had been slipping away in recent years. These meetings became a cornerstone of the movement, a place where residents could share their truths without judgment, and where James could begin to shape a shared vision. As the meetings continued, James was surprised to find allies in unexpected places. One of the most vocal proponents of the new approach was Mrs. Hart, the elderly woman who had first spoken at the town hall. She had once been skeptical of change, but her own experience with Officer Blake had opened her eyes to the importance of community trust and transparency. Now she spoke passionately about the need for reform, her voice steady and filled with conviction. Her presence inspired others, and soon, people who had once been hesitant began to see the value in James's vision. She became a quiet powerhouse, attending every meeting, encouraging others, and rallying support among her friends and neighbors. Even Officer Blake, after weeks of reflection and soul-searching, began to show signs of transformation. At first he was distant, his pride bruised by the public criticism he had faced. But over time, he came to recognize that the anger directed toward him wasn't personal. It was a response to a larger issue that had simply come to a head through him. Slowly, he began participating in the meetings, often sitting silently at the back, listening to the stories of the people he had once viewed through a lens of suspicion. James noticed the subtle shift in Blake's demeanor, the way he began to look at the townspeople with more empathy, more humility. The community, in turn, started to see him less as an enforcer and more as a man trying to find his way. One day, during a particularly crowded meeting, Blake stood up and asked to speak. The room fell silent, all eyes on him. Blake hesitated, his voice shaky but resolute, and began to apologize, not just to James, but to everyone he had wronged, everyone he had dismissed or treated unfairly. He spoke of his rigid training, his background in a city where trust was scarce and threats were abundant. But he acknowledged that he had been wrong to bring that mentality to a place like theirs, a town that was built on relationships, not on rigid control. He promised to learn, to grow, and to earn back the trust he had lost. There was a long, quiet pause when he finished, but then Mrs. Hart began to clap, slowly at first, then with increasing vigor. Others joined in, and for the first time, Blake saw genuine acceptance in their faces. It was a small moment, but it marked a turning point. As trust began to rebuild, James and the town council worked to implement new community policing initiatives. They started a mentorship program for new officers, pairing them with longtime residents who would teach them about the town's history, values, and culture. Officer Blake was one of the first to volunteer as a mentor, wanting to ensure that no one else made the mistakes he had. The mentorship program helped bridge the gap between the police and the community, fostering a deeper understanding and empathy. Officers began to know the people they served as individuals, not just as names or faces in a crowd, and this understanding made a profound difference. Another initiative was the creation of regular coffee with a cop events at local cafes. These gatherings allowed residents to interact with officers in a relaxed, informal setting, fostering open communication and reducing the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. At first, the attendance was modest, with only a handful of people showing up, wary of what these events would accomplish. But as word spread, more people came, drawn by the chance to engage with law enforcement in a way that felt personal and empowering. Officers and residents shared stories, laughed over cups of coffee, and began to see each other as allies rather than adversaries. James continued to work tirelessly, balancing his responsibilities as a teacher with his newfound role as a community leader. His days were long, filled with meetings, phone calls, and countless conversations. He missed the simplicity of his old life, the quiet predictability of his classroom, but he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. His students began looking up to him in a new way, inspired by his dedication to justice and integrity. They saw in him a model of resilience and compassion, and James took comfort in the knowledge that he was helping to shape the next generation of leaders. One evening, after a particularly long day, James received an unexpected phone call from the mayor. She sounded excited, even relieved, as she informed him that their town had been chosen to receive a state grant aimed at promoting community police relations. The grant would fund additional training, community events, and outreach programs, giving their efforts a significant boost. It was a testament to everything they had achieved, a recognition of the hard work, the sacrifices, and the courage it had taken to rebuild trust from the ground up. James felt a surge of pride, realizing that their town had become a model for others, a beacon of hope in a time when so many communities were struggling with similar issues. The grant allowed for the expansion of the mentorship program, as well as the creation of a youth advisory council, where young people could engage with law enforcement and local officials, bringing fresh perspectives and innovative ideas to the table. James encouraged his students to get involved, to use their voices and contribute to the future of their town. The council became a thriving platform for dialogue, a place where young people felt empowered to speak openly about their hopes and concerns. It was a far cry from the silence and fear that had once gripped the community, a testament to how far they had come. As the years passed, the changes James had helped initiate became woven into the fabric of the town. The tensions that had once threatened to tear them apart faded into memory, replaced by a sense of unity and resilience. Officer Blake had become a respected figure, known for his kindness and dedication, and the mentorship program he helped launch had transformed the culture of the police department. People who once viewed the police with suspicion now saw them as allies, protectors, and friends. And James, though he had never sought the role of leader, had become a beloved figure in the community, a symbol of strength and compassion. He had faced his fears, challenged injustice, and brought people together in a way that few could. His journey had been filled with hardship, but he had emerged from it with a deeper understanding of what it meant to stand up for what was right, to fight for a better world even when the odds seemed insurmountable. One evening, years after that fateful day in the cafe, James sat down at his usual table, sipping a cup of coffee and watching the familiar faces of his town pass by. The cafe had become a symbol of renewal, a place where people gathered not out of habit, but out of a genuine desire to connect. He felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that his town was a better place, that they had created something lasting and meaningful together. As he looked around, he saw Mrs. Hart, now older but still sharp as ever, waving to him from across the room. He waved back, feeling a surge of gratitude for everyone who had stood by him, for the courage they had shown, for the unity they had built. It hadn't been easy, but they had done it. They had overcome division, distrust, and fear, and they had emerged stronger for it. And as the sun set over the town, casting a warm glow over the familiar streets, James knew that he had helped create something truly extraordinary, something that would endure long after he was gone. In that moment, he realized that this was the legacy he would leave behind, not as a teacher or a community leader, but as a man who had dared to believe in the power of compassion, resilience, and unity. It was a legacy that would inspire others, a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage could spark a transformation that would change the world. And with a quiet smile, James lifted his coffee cup in a silent toast to the town he had helped rebuild, to the community that had taught him the true meaning of home. As time went on, the profound transformation James had helped foster continued to shape the town in ways he could never have anticipated. The programs and initiatives he'd spearheaded had begun to take on lives of their own, expanding and evolving as more people got involved. What started as a desperate attempt to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the community had blossomed into something far greater, a movement that was reshaping the culture, values, and very fabric of the town. James found himself standing at the center of it all, humbled and amazed by how a single event had sparked such meaningful change. One of the most inspiring outcomes was the Youth Advisory Council. Initially envisioned as a small group of high school students and young adults who would meet with town officials and law enforcement, It had quickly grown into a vibrant forum that attracted young people from all backgrounds. They came not only to discuss local issues, but also to envision and design a future for the town. This council became a place where young voices could speak freely, where ideas flowed and new leaders emerged. James often attended the council meetings as a mentor, watching with pride as the next generation took ownership of their town's future. They tackled difficult topics, from racial equity and environmental sustainability to economic development and public safety. The students proposed bold initiatives, such as developing a community garden that doubled as a food bank for families in need, and organizing monthly unity walks, where residents from all walks of life could come together and share their stories. One particular council member, a high school senior named Aliyah, stood out to James. She had been one of his history students, a quiet girl with a sharp mind and a passion for justice. Inspired by James's story, Aliyah had become one of the council's most outspoken members, advocating tirelessly for initiatives that would improve life for everyone in the town. She organized a Day of Remembrance, an event to honor the town's history and reflect on the journey they had all taken since James's arrest. The event was held in the town square, drawing a crowd that included people of all ages and backgrounds. As Aliyah spoke about the importance of resilience and unity, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that his efforts had helped ignite a flame of leadership within her and so many others. Meanwhile, the community police mentorship program continued to thrive. Officer Blake, who had once been viewed as the outsider who nearly tore the town apart, was now fully integrated into the town's heartbeat. He had become the face of the department's new approach, leading with empathy and an open mind. Blake took on the role of mentoring each new officer who joined the force, ensuring they understood the town's values and the importance of treating every individual with respect. He shared his own story openly, speaking about his initial mistakes and the lessons he'd learned. His humility and willingness to grow had won over even the most skeptical residents, and he had become a respected figure in the community. Blake and James developed a friendship grounded in mutual respect, both of them acknowledging the difficult path that had led them there. As the months turned into years, James noticed something else remarkable. People from outside the town had begun taking an interest in their story. News of the town's journey spread, drawing visitors, journalists, and even policymakers who were curious about how a small community had managed to bridge divides that had seemed insurmountable. Journalists conducted interviews with residents, teachers, students, and officers, capturing the essence of the town's resilience and the lessons it held for others. A documentary filmmaker even reached out to James, wanting to capture the town's transformation on film. At first, James hesitated. He worried that the media attention might disrupt the delicate balance they had worked so hard to build. But the community encouraged him to share their story, believing it could inspire other towns struggling with similar challenges. Reluctantly, James agreed, and the filmmaker spent months documenting the town's journey, capturing the beauty of their triumphs and the raw honesty of their struggles. The documentary became a sensation, highlighting the town's journey from division to unity and the power of community-driven change. People around the country watched as James and his fellow townspeople spoke candidly about their experiences, their fears, and their hopes. The film showcased the transformative impact of the programs they had built and celebrated the courage it took for an entire town to look inward and make amends. James watched the finished film with mixed emotions, feeling both pride and humility. The story was no longer just his. It belonged to the entire town, to everyone who had played a role in shaping it. Following the documentary's release, James received countless letters and emails from people who had been moved by the town's story. Some were from towns struggling with their own divisions, asking for advice and guidance. Others were from individuals who had faced similar experiences and found hope in knowing that change was possible. Many expressed admiration for James's quiet bravery, for his decision to stand up when it mattered most. James read each letter, responding when he could, offering words of encouragement and sharing what he had learned. He saw that the town's story had become a beacon for others, a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of never giving up on the place you call home. As the town's influence grew, so did the opportunities for collaboration and learning. Local leaders from other towns began visiting, hoping to learn from the community's approach to police reform and youth engagement. James found himself in the role of a mentor, guiding other communities through the same steps he had taken, helping them understand the importance of open communication, empathy, and community involvement. He spoke at conferences, met with policymakers, and shared the town's experiences in a way that felt surreal to him, considering how all of this had started. But he never lost sight of the humble roots of their journey, always reminding people that real change didn't come from speeches or grand gestures. It came from listening, from understanding, and from the courage to admit when you were wrong. With the town's newfound fame came new challenges, as growth and change always do. As people began moving to the town, drawn by its reputation for unity and compassion, some longtime residents worried that the influx of newcomers might disrupt the delicate balance they had worked so hard to achieve. James understood their concerns and took steps to ensure that the spirit of the community remained strong. He organized welcoming committees for new residents, encouraging them to learn about the town's history and values. Monthly community conversations became a staple event where residents, old and new, could come together to discuss their hopes and fears, share their stories, and build connections. These gatherings helped preserve the town's unique culture, ensuring that even as they grew, they remained grounded in the values that had brought them together in the first place. In his quieter moments, James often reflected on how much his life had changed. He was no longer just the quiet history teacher who blended into the background. He had become a voice for his town, a guide, and a symbol of resilience. Yet he remained deeply humble, always reminding himself that he was just one person in a tapestry of lives and stories that had come together to create something extraordinary. He took comfort in knowing that the town's future was in good hands, especially with young leaders like Aaliyah, who had blossomed into a powerful advocate for justice and equity. Watching her and others take on leadership roles, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that the community they had built would endure. One evening, as he walked through the town square, James paused to take in the sight around him. Families were gathered, children playing, neighbors laughing together. The air was filled with a warmth that was almost tangible, a feeling of belonging that was rare in a world so often marked by division. He felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for everything they had accomplished together, for the friendships that had been forged, the wounds that had healed, and the future they had built. And though his journey had been unexpected and filled with challenges, James knew that every step had been worth it. He had witnessed the power of a community united, the strength that came from people choosing to listen, to forgive, and to stand by each other. In a world that often seemed fractured and uncertain, his town had become a reminder of what was possible when people came together with open hearts and minds. As the sun set over the town, casting a golden glow across the square, James found himself smiling, content in the knowledge that he was part of something beautiful, something lasting. The town had not only found healing, it had found hope, and in doing so, it had become a place where anyone, from any walk of life, could come and feel like they belonged. And that, he knew, was a legacy worth fighting for. Years passed, and the town continued to thrive as a model of resilience, compassion, and unity. The transformation James had helped initiate had become part of the town's DNA, a living testament to the power of empathy and collective action. People from all walks of life now called the town home, drawn by its reputation for openness and understanding. The community that had once been on the brink of division was now a beacon of hope, a place where people came to learn, to heal, and to grow. James had returned to his teaching role full-time, though his days looked a bit different now. Alongside history, he taught classes on civic responsibility, empathy, and community building, courses he had developed in response to everything the town had been through. Students were eager to learn about their town's history and its journey from division to unity. They listened wide-eyed as James shared stories of the challenges, the victories, and the courage it had taken to bridge the divides. His classroom had become a place where young people could envision the kind of future they wanted to create, not only for themselves but for the world around them. One day, James received a letter from a prestigious university inviting him to deliver a keynote speech on community resilience and restorative justice. The invitation surprised him. He was still that same quiet teacher who had never sought the spotlight, but he understood the importance of sharing his town's story with others who might be facing similar challenges. He accepted the invitation, and in the following weeks, he poured himself into preparing his speech, reflecting on everything he'd learned over the years. As he crafted his message, he realized just how much he had grown, how his understanding of justice, compassion, and leadership had deepened. When the day of the speech arrived, James stood before an audience of academics, policymakers, students, and community leaders. He spoke from the heart, recounting the story of his town, the struggles they had faced, the lessons they had learned, and the powerful change that had emerged from one small but significant choice. He spoke about the importance of listening, the courage it took to acknowledge mistakes, and the strength of a community united by shared purpose. His words resonated deeply, and by the end of his speech, the audience was on their feet, applauding not only him but the journey his town had taken. It was a humbling moment for James, a reminder that their story had become more than just a local narrative. It was a message of hope and possibility for communities everywhere. Upon his return, James found that his speech had made waves far beyond the walls of the university. Communities across the country reached out, seeking guidance and inspiration for their own journeys toward unity and justice. His town became a center for workshops, gatherings, and training sessions, a place where leaders and community members from all backgrounds came to learn about restorative practices, empathy-based leadership, and community engagement. James and his fellow townspeople hosted these visitors with open arms, sharing their experiences, their wisdom, and the lessons they had learned through hardship and healing. One day, a group of young leaders from a distant city visited the town. They were dealing with similar issues: distrust between residents and law enforcement, divisions rooted in fear and misunderstanding, and a community frayed by years of conflict. James met with them personally, listening to their stories and offering words of encouragement. He could see the same pain and frustration in their eyes that he had once felt, the same weariness of people struggling to find common ground in a world that often seemed to pull them apart. He guided them through the town, showing them the community garden, the youth council center, and the police station where Officer Blake, now the town's police chief, greeted them with warmth and humility. He showed them the ways in which small acts of kindness, understanding, and courage had transformed a once divided town into a sanctuary of unity. The young leaders left inspired, carrying with them a spark of hope they hadn't felt in a long time. They returned to their own community, implementing some of the practices James and his town had pioneered. Over time, James heard news of their progress, of the changes they were making, and he felt a deep sense of pride and fulfillment. His town's story had become a seed, planting the idea of possibility in places that desperately needed it. Through countless small connections, they were creating a ripple effect, spreading the message that change was possible, that resilience and compassion could overcome even the most deeply rooted divisions. As he watched these transformations unfold, James began to dream of something even bigger. He envisioned a network of communities working together, supporting each other in their efforts to foster understanding and build bridges. With the support of the town council and community members, he began organizing a national conference on community resilience to be held in their own town. The conference would bring together leaders, activists, educators, and residents from towns and cities across the country. It would be a place for sharing stories, exchanging ideas, and cultivating hope, a place where people could learn from each other's struggles and triumphs. When the conference finally took place, it was a breathtaking sight. The town was filled with people from every corner of the country, each one carrying their own dreams, challenges, and aspirations. They gathered in the town square, in the community center, in parks and cafes, sharing meals and stories, building connections that transcended geography and background. James walked among them, humbled by the power of community, the sheer resilience and strength of people who were willing to stand together, even in the face of adversity. The town buzzed with energy and optimism, a testament to what could be achieved when people chose to listen, to trust, and to believe in each other. One evening, as the conference was winding down, James found himself standing in the town square, looking out at the crowd that had gathered for the closing ceremony. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the faces of the people he had come to know and love. He saw familiar faces, friends, students, neighbors, and, of course, Officer Blake, who stood by his side with a sense of quiet pride. He also saw the new faces of visitors from distant places, people who had come seeking guidance and hope, and had found a second home here in the small town. It was a moment of profound peace, a moment that encapsulated everything they had worked for and everything they had become. As he stood there, a young woman from another town approached him, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights. She thanked him for his leadership, for his willingness to share his story and his town's journey. She told him that she had been inspired to bring the lessons she had learned back to her own community, to help heal the divisions that had torn it apart. James listened, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. In her eyes, he saw the same hope, the same determination that had fueled his own journey all those years ago. He realized then that their story was not just his, not just the town's. It belonged to everyone who had ever fought for a better world, everyone who believed in the power of unity and compassion. As the closing ceremony began, James was asked to give a final speech. Standing before the crowd, he looked out at the sea of faces, each one a testament to the strength and resilience of the human spirit. He spoke about the journey they had taken, the hardships they had overcome, and the hope that had carried them through. He spoke about the importance of empathy, the courage it took to forgive, and the strength they had found in each other. His words echoed through the square, filling the air with a sense of possibility, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness and understanding could change the world. When he finished, the crowd erupted in applause, a powerful, heartfelt expression of gratitude and solidarity. People embraced, tears glistening in their eyes, as they celebrated not just the end of the conference, but the beginning of something far greater. The town had become a symbol, a beacon of hope for communities everywhere, and James knew that they had created something that would endure, a legacy of compassion, courage, and unity that would live on in the hearts of everyone who had been touched by their story. As the crowd began to disperse, James took one last look around, feeling a profound sense of peace. His journey had come full circle, from an ordinary man caught in extraordinary circumstances to a leader, a teacher, a friend, and a guide. He had seen his town grow and change in ways he could never have imagined, and he knew that their story was far from over. The seeds they had planted would continue to grow, spreading hope and resilience to places that needed it most. And as he turned to leave, he felt a deep, abiding joy, knowing that he had been part of something beautiful, something that would inspire generations to come. The town's legacy would live on, a testament to the power of community, compassion, and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit.